In the hushed galleries of the Louvre, a curious scene repeats itself daily. Visitors pause before an ancient Egyptian statue, a seated woman nursing an infant at her breast. The bronze gleams with age, nearly 3,000 years separating us from the hands that cast it. Then moments later, these same visitors stand transfixed before a medieval Madonna, her posture identical, the infant at her breast in precisely the same arrangement. The centuries collapse, the names change, but the image, that primal icon of maternal divinity nursing the sacred child, remains hauntingly, impossibly the same. What invisible thread connects these two mothers across the abyss of time and faith? The early church father Tertullian once declared with exasperation, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" But perhaps the more revealing question for our inquiry is this: what has the Nile to do with Nazareth? As the philosopher Mircea Eliade observed, the sacred always manifests itself as a reality of a wholly different order from natural realities. Yet when we trace the manifestations of the sacred feminine across cultures and centuries, we discover something more nuanced. A deliberate strategy of translation and engineering of the holy that reveals as much about human psychology as it does about theological doctrine. In this exploration, we will walk the shadowed corridors where ancient devotion transforms without disappearing, where the great Mother of Egypt becomes the Queen of Heaven, where functions remain constant even as names and narratives shift like desert sands beneath our feet. Let us step into a world that no longer exists except in fragments, the world where Isis reigned as the most beloved goddess of the ancient Mediterranean. Imagine Alexandria in the 2nd century of the Common Era. Above the harbor chaos rises the great Serapeum, drawing pilgrims from Rome to Mesopotamia. Inside, the air thick with frankincense, worshippers kneel before the goddess wearing her lunar crown, robes the color of night sky, cradling the infant Horus. Women pray to her for safe childbirth. Sailors beg her protection on treacherous seas. The sick touch her statue's garment, hoping for miraculous healing. She is Stella Maris, star of the sea. She is Regina Coeli, Queen of Heaven. She is the Mother of God, the one who intercedes between suffering humanity and the distant throne of the divine. But Isis was not always this cosmic queen. To understand her power, we must trace her lineage back to Hathor, the cow goddess whose worship stretches to the dawn of pharaonic civilization. Hathor embodied the nurturing, protective aspects of the feminine divine. Wet nurse of pharaohs, lady of the sycamore tree dispensing the water of life. Her temples at Dendera stood as monuments to her role as sustainer of all life. As Egyptian religion evolved, Hathor's attributes gradually merged with Isis. Where Hathor had been primarily the nourishing mother, Isis became something more complex. A goddess who suffered, who mourned, who searched desperately for murdered Osiris, who protected her son against all threats. She was the mother who understood grief, who interceded actively, who combined accessibility with cosmic power. This evolution created a template of divine femininity that spoke to the deepest human needs. A sacred figure who has experienced suffering yet offers hope, who possesses power yet remains approachable. By the time Rome conquered Egypt in 30 BCE, the cult of Isis had spread throughout the Mediterranean world. Unlike the capricious gods of the Greek and Roman pantheons, Isis offered something revolutionary: personal relationship, guaranteed salvation, and the promise that devotion would be rewarded with intervention in daily struggles. Her mysteries initiated followers into secrets of death and rebirth. Her festivals drew massive crowds. She was the dominant expression of the sacred feminine at the precise historical moment when Christianity began its own expansion through these same regions. Here is where our investigation moves from fascinating parallel to revealing pattern. When early Christian missionaries moved through the Roman Empire, they faced a profound challenge. How do you convince populations deeply devoted to maternal divine figures that they must abandon these forms of worship entirely? How do you fill the spiritual void left when you ask people to relinquish the goddess who has protected their families for generations, who has heard their most intimate prayers, who has offered comfort in childbirth and mourning? The brilliant solution was not to demand complete rupture, but to offer continuity within transformation. This was not unique to Christianity. It represented a time-tested strategy of religious expansion throughout history. But what the Church accomplished with Mary represented something more sophisticated, a theological translation that maintained functional continuity while asserting doctrinal discontinuity. The architecture of devotion could remain largely intact, only the theological framework needed to shift. Consider the practical wisdom embedded in this approach. A village in Asia Minor has, for centuries, processed to a spring sacred to Artemis, where women seeking children offer flowers and prayers. You could condemn this practice as demonic paganism and command its immediate cessation, but experience had shown that such demands often led to resistance, martyrdom, and secret syncretistic practices impossible to control. Or you could offer an alternative. Tell them that yes, there is indeed a sacred presence at this spring, but her true name is Mary, and she too protects women in childbirth. She too answers prayers for children. The village continues its procession, now carrying an icon instead of a statue. The theological content has shifted dramatically. Mary is not divine, but honored as God's chosen vessel. Yet the spiritual function, the communal ritual, the psychological comfort, all remain remarkably similar. Exclusive limited-time offer, 80% off the Hidden Codex collection. Receive the wisdom of all 22 volumes and, as an unmissable bonus, the 7 frequencies of manifestation, a journey with the Sophia Codex. Click the link in the description and in the first comment. This is not conspiracy, but religious pragmatism, and it left traces everywhere. The evidence spans multiple categories, each reinforcing the others. The iconographic evidence strikes first because it is so visually undeniable. The pose of Isis nursing Horus, goddess seated on a throne, divine child at her breast, protective hand cradling his head, transfers with almost photographic precision to early Christian depictions of Mary nursing Jesus. The Madonna lactans becomes one of the most popular iconographic types in Christianity. The colors follow familiar patterns. Isis wore blue and gold, associated with night sky and celestial queenship. Mary's robes shimmer in these same hues. The gestures speak a language older than words, the hand raised in blessing, the gaze of tender concern. Even symbolic elements migrate intact. The star symbolism connecting Isis as Stella Maris to Mary with the same title, the moon beneath the feet, the crown of stars. But perhaps even more revealing is the linguistic archaeology of Mary's titles. Stella Maris, Star of the Sea, was Isis's title long before Mary's. Regina Coeli, Queen of Heaven, echoes directly from Isis's role as sovereign of the celestial realm. Mater Dolorosa finds its prototype in Isis, mourning murdered Osiris. These are not vague similarities, but precise translations. Titles that carried specific meanings in the ancient world, now transferred wholesale to a new theological context. The pattern suggests not accidental parallel development, but intentional appropriation, a deliberate strategy of making the new faith speak in the spiritual vocabulary Mediterranean peoples already understood and trusted. The calendar reveals its own story. When the Feast of the Assumption was fixed on August 15th, it aligned precisely with ancient festivals celebrating Isis's assumption into heaven. Throughout the Christian liturgical year, Marian feasts cluster around dates that once honored various goddess manifestations: spring festivals of renewal, harvest celebrations, winter solstice observances of divine birth. The temporal architecture of devotion remained stable even as theological narrative shifted. Walk into certain ancient churches, and you can feel older structures beneath the Christian veneer. At Philae, a church dedicated to Mary, stands atop an Isis temple, foundation stones bearing hieroglyphs praising the goddess. The ritual continuities prove equally striking. The processions carrying statues through streets, a practice that had characterized goddess worship, continue seamlessly as Marian processions. The offering of flowers and candles at shrines, touching or kissing sacred images, maintenance of special gardens and wells, the tradition of pilgrimage to healing sanctuaries, all transfer from goddess cult to Marian devotion, with barely a shift in form. Perhaps nowhere is this pattern more dramatically visible than in Ephesus. Picture the scene in 431 CE. The city streets throng with bishops, theologians, monks, and local citizens. Inside the Church of Mary, the council debates rage. Nestorius argues that Mary should be called Christotokos, Christ-bearer, but not Theotokos, God-bearer. Cyril of Alexandria insists Mary must be honored as Theotokos because she bore the incarnate God. The theological stakes seem purely Christological, defining Jesus, not exalting Mary. Yet outside the council chambers, the people of Ephesus know better. When the decision is announced in Mary's favor, the city erupts in celebration. Torchlight processions wind through streets that had witnessed identical processions for Artemis. Women weep with joy that the Mother of God has been recognized. Why such fervor over what might seem an abstract theological point? Because the people understood. They had just witnessed the official sanction of a divine maternal figure who could be venerated, prayed to, and loved. The void left by Artemis's decline had been filled. The Great Mother had returned, wearing different robes, speaking different theological language, but manifesting the same essential functions human hearts had always sought in the sacred feminine. The pattern repeats across the ancient world. In Rome and southern Italy, where Isis temples had flourished, Marian devotion takes particularly strong root. The famous Black Madonnas of Europe, whose dark coloring has puzzled scholars, may preserve echoes of Isis's appearance in certain iconographic traditions. In the British Isles and Gaul, local Celtic goddesses associated with wells and sacred groves blend with Romano-British goddess forms, then emerge in Christian guise as both saints and regional manifestations of Mary. Saint Brigid of Kildare, whose feast coincides with pagan Imbolc, whose association with fire mirrors the goddess Brigid, represents this complex layering. This brings us to a dimension often overlooked, the economy of the sacred. Great temples employed priests, scribes, musicians, gardeners. They supported industries of votive offerings, sacred objects, religious artifacts. Pilgrimage routes generated income for innkeepers, guides, merchants. Remove all of this overnight, and you create not just spiritual crisis, but economic catastrophe. The transition to Christianity preserved much of this structure. Artisans who had crafted Isis statues applied their skills to creating Mary images. Pilgrimage routes remained active, with Christian shrines replacing pagan sacred sites. Votive offerings continued, ex-votos depicting healed body parts, silver representations of answered prayers. An entire infrastructure of sacred economics persisted, adapted rather than destroyed. This continuity extended to social services. Isis temples had functioned as centers of education, refuge for the distressed, medical care, spiritual counsel. As Christianity became institutionalized, these functions found new homes. Shrines to Mary became pilgrimage centers where the sick sought healing, where women in difficult pregnancies came to pray. The Church established hospitals, orphanages, and schools, often associated with Marian devotion. This brings us to the most profound question: why does this pattern emerge so consistently? The answer lies in deep human psychological and spiritual needs. The purely transcendent God addresses certain spiritual needs magnificently. Our capacity for awe, for contemplation of ultimate reality, for ethical absolutes. But transcendence creates an experiential problem. How do you approach a deity so far beyond human categories? How do you express immediate, messy, embodied needs to infinite perfection? The sacred feminine solves this dilemma by offering accessibility combined with power. She is approachable because she has experienced what we experience. Both Isis and Mary have been mothers, known vulnerability, felt grief, protected a child against danger. Yet she is also powerful, connected to cosmic forces, capable of intercession. She occupies crucial middle ground in the geography of the sacred, neither entirely transcendent nor merely mortal, but a bridge between realms. The mother archetype carries specific psychological resonances that make it universally powerful. When religious systems map maternal qualities onto divine figures, they tap into primal patterns. The mother becomes the one who understands without judgment, who protects without condition, who loves with fierce particularity rather than abstract universality. Seekers. We've just launched a new channel dedicated to spiritual awakening and manifestation, The Hidden Path. To welcome new subscribers, we're offering a complimentary ebook, Alignment, 7 Phases of Consciousness Awakening. Get your copy by subscribing to the channel using the link in the description. The cartography of Marian devotion reveals this pattern starkly. Where Isis, Cybele, Artemis, or Diana were deeply rooted, there Marian devotion flourishes with particular intensity. Italy, especially the south where Greek and Egyptian influences mingled, becomes a landscape of Marian shrines. Egypt and the Levant preserved strong Marian traditions in their Christian minorities. The map does not prove causation in any simple sense, but it strongly suggests Christianity adapted itself to existing spiritual landscapes. At this point you may ask, does not the Church itself explain this differently? Indeed it does, and intellectual honesty demands we consider these official explanations. Catholic theology insists that Mary receives not worship, latria, reserved for God alone, but veneration, hyperdulia, categorically different from worship due to God. This distinction is not sophistry. It represents a genuine attempt to maintain monotheism while acknowledging Mary's unique role. In official doctrine, Mary has no divine nature, works no miracles by her own power. She is honored because God honored her by choosing her as the vessel of incarnation. Furthermore, theologians point to typology, figures and events in the Old Testament prefiguring New Testament realities. Mary is understood as the new Ark, the new Eve, fulfillment of types embedded in Scripture itself. From this perspective, Marian devotion develops from deep meditation on biblical texts. The titles Regina Coeli and Stella Maris can be derived from passages in Revelation and from interpretation of Song of Songs. This represents a sophisticated theological response, rooting Marian devotion in Christian sources rather than pagan borrowings. These arguments deserve respect, and they are not entirely incompatible with the historical patterns we have traced. Both things can be true simultaneously, that Christian thinkers developed Marian theology through biblical interpretation, and that the enthusiastic popular reception owed something to pre-existing spiritual templates shaped by centuries of goddess worship. Christianity did not simply rebrand Isis as Mary. The theological content shifted dramatically. Mary's power is intercessory, not autonomous. Her role as mother of Jesus differs categorically from Isis as mother of Horus the god. Yet beneath these real theological differences, the functional similarities remain striking. What then persists across this transformation, and what genuinely changes? The forms of devotion persist. The pilgrimages, processions, offerings, sacred sites, iconography, ritual vocabulary. The psychological and social functions persist. Accessible sacred presence, offering of hope, creation of community, marking of life transitions. The economic structures largely persist. Artisanal production, pilgrimage economies, religious specialists maintaining shrines. But the theological framework transforms decisively. Mary is not a goddess and cannot be approached as one within Orthodox Christianity. Her power is derivative. Her role is to point beyond herself to Christ. The ontology has shifted, even where the phenomenology remains similar. The narrative shifts entirely. Isis's mythology of sexual love, death, resurrection, and magical power becomes Mary's narrative of faithful obedience, miraculous conception, maternal suffering, and assumption into heaven. Yet both narratives center on a mother who suffers, loves utterly, protects her child against cosmic forces, triumphs over death, and reigns in heaven. What does this mean for us? It reveals something profound about how traditions survive through apparent change. Human spirituality operates not primarily through abstract propositions, but through images, stories, rituals, and relationships. When religions spread and cultures collide, the traditions that survive are those that speak to deep human needs while adapting to new frameworks. The transformation of goddess worship into Marian devotion represents a masterwork of cultural translation, honoring what was spiritually vital in older traditions while embedding it within a new theological vision. It also teaches us about the enduring power of the sacred feminine. Across vast stretches of history, people have intuited that the divine cannot be adequately represented by masculine symbols alone. Christianity, developing within patriarchal cultures and insisting on masculine imagery for God, might have been expected to suppress the feminine divine entirely, yet it could not. The spiritual need proved too powerful. The feminine sacred found its way back, not as goddess, but as supremely honored mother. The distinction matters theologically, but functionally, Mary provides millions with what goddesses once provided. A face of the divine that welcomes their tears, hears their specific needs, embodies compassion in maternal form. This history invites us to think more deeply about syncretism itself. The word often carries negative connotations, suggesting impurity or compromise. Yet all religious traditions that have survived are syncretic. They have incorporated elements from their contexts, adapted to circumstances, absorbed influences from neighboring traditions. This is not corruption but vitality. The question is never whether a tradition is syncretic, but whether the synthesis achieves coherence, whether adapted elements serve the tradition's core purposes. The transformation we have traced represents one of history's most successful religious syntheses. It allowed millions to transition from one religious system to another without abandoning forms of devotion that had structured their spiritual lives. It preserved sacred feminine presence that human psychology requires. It created theological frameworks maintaining monotheism while honoring diversity in sacred manifestation. And perhaps most importantly, this history reveals that authentic devotion and cultural construction are not opposites. The millions who have knelt before Mary's images, who have poured out their hearts, who have found comfort and healing through Marian devotion, their experiences are not invalidated by understanding the historical processes that shaped devotional forms. The sacred can work through cultural forms, through historical processes, through the messy business of religious competition and adaptation. To understand the architecture does not demolish the building. It allows us to appreciate both the vision of the architects and the way the structure has sheltered generations of believers. In the golden sand of the Nile Valley, mothers once held babies up to Hathor's gaze, praying for protection. In the gleaming temples of Alexandria, initiates trembled before Isis's mysteries. In the marble cathedrals of Europe, pilgrims weep before the Virgin, asking her intercession. The names have changed, the theological explanations have shifted, the institutional structures have transformed. But the human heart, reaching toward the divine, seeking a face of sacred compassion, asking for maternal protection in a dangerous world that remains constant. This is not about revealing fraud or exposing deception. It is about witnessing the remarkable persistence of human spiritual need and the equally remarkable capacity to translate sacred forms across cultural boundaries. It is about understanding that tradition is always both conservation and innovation, both continuity and change. It is about recognizing that the sacred manifests through history, not despite it, and that seeing the human fingerprints on our religious forms need not diminish our sense that something beyond the human also touches us through these channels. From the dawn-lit temples where Hathor received offerings, to the incense-shrouded sanctuaries where Isis heard millions of prayers, to the candlelit grottos where Mary's image draws modern pilgrims, a single thread of devotion stretches unbroken across 3,000 years. If you have found your way to this exploration, you are part of that long tradition of seekers who refuse simple answers, who want to understand not just what to believe, but how belief works, how it has been shaped across centuries while maintaining its power to console, inspire, and transform. Understanding the architecture behind our spiritual experiences does not diminish them. It reveals the remarkable ingenuity of human spiritual consciousness, our capacity to preserve what is essential while adapting form to circumstance. This knowledge deepens appreciation for the complex, beautiful processes through which the sacred and the historical interweave, creating traditions that shelter the human spirit across generations. If you enjoy our content and want to support us, consider becoming a channel member. Your membership will give you access to exclusive content, such as audiobook versions of our ebooks.